there's a Persian poet named Rumi. He says, you can spread light two ways. You can be the candle or you can be the mirror.
I'm so happy to be joined by Reza Shadmir today. Reza is a professor of biomedical engineering and neuroscience at Johns Hopkins here. So very exciting. And your research has been a huge deal. I know you probably don't like to brag, but in motor control, a lot of your papers and research has been very influential. Reza has, for those of you that are scientists, H index of 88, very big deal. It's the scientist equivalent of being in the NFL or All Pro or something. It's really awesome.
That's an interesting analogy. I never thought
I
about
was trying
it.
to,
That's lovely.
I was trying to think
That's
of how
lovely.
to make that relatable to people.
That's cool. That's a cool analogy. Good for you, bro.
And you've been doing a lot of research on something that's, I think, very important for us in sports and in any movement field of how do we control movement, right? How do we learn movement? How can we understand how we learn movement if we don't know how we control movement? I've been very interested in ecological dynamics the last few years.
Right.
And we've talked about this a little bit, where this is kind of like this newer, less heard of field that's proposing that we're not really using internal models to control our movement. Mm. And so it's great to be here with you, that you've developed some of the most modern internal models of like how we believe that we might be controlling movement. And so I think this is a really exciting conversation to have. And
wonderful. So if we're going to talk about internal models, let's do an experiment together.
Great.
Should we do that?
Yes.
Okay, I'm gonna you sit right here.
Okay.
And we're gonna do an experiment. Okay.
All right.
So I'm gonna get a book. Here's a book. And I'm gonna are you right-handed or left-handed?
Right-handed.
Okay, put out your left hand. All right. So lift it off of here. All right. Yeah, something comfortable. Yeah. So you just hold it like that. So more or less like that. Good. Okay. Hold it nice and steady. Okay, nice and steady. Okay, now you pick it up with your other hand. Yeah. Did you see what happened?
Uh-huh.
Okay. So your arm remained perfectly stationary when you picked it up. But when I picked it up, it went up. Why?
That's a great question.
Why is it that when you do it, the arm that's holding this is perfectly still? But when I do it, somebody else is picking the book off your hand, you can't hold the arm still. And the idea there is that when you're doing it yourself, your brain is generating the commands to your right arm, and at the same time, it's predicting what's going to happen as you lift the mass. And what's really beautiful is that you probably have never held this book in your arm, right? We never did this experiment before. There's no learning here, right? But your brain knew how much weight I'm going to lift off this arm, and therefore how to precisely turn down the biceps muscle, just the right amount, so it doesn't fall, but it stays where it was. So it compensated for the activity by the fact that it could predict, this is the weight that I'm going to lift off. That coordination is an example of the ability of the system to predict. And it breaks down when parts of the brain that are involved in presumably making these predictions are damaged. So that concept is one of the things, I think, to me, that illustrates that our brain is all about predicting, compensating. Okay, I'll put the book back.
Yeah. So
okay, what do you think of that?
Yeah, I mean, I think before we get into that, I think let's get deep into I want to understand your perspective and the model.
So I'll tell you a little bit about why I became interested in movement control. First of all, I think movements are beautiful. We pay to see beautiful movements. I don't know if you've ever had a chance to see a professional athlete. I go to the Oreo games and I like to go sit as close as I can to the athletes, because when you're actually close to them, you first of all, you notice the size. These are large people. And then you notice the speed with which they move. And it's incredible.
Yeah.
Incredible to actually see the elegance up close of this body in motion. And we pay to see beautiful things move because it's pleasurable. You can't help but wonder, like, how do they do it? How is it possible? When I was a graduate student, I took courses in robotics because I thought it was the closest thing that science had to describing in some formal way how to control movements, right? Because Feynman says that if I don't know how to build it, I don't know how it works. And so
Yeah.
robotics is like, sort of like the closest thing we have to, do we really know how to build it?
Yeah.
And if somebody could teach me this is how you build it, then I could perhaps understand how it works. And so when I was taking robotics courses, I realized that even the simplest systems that have, 2, 3 links attached to them, if you write down the equations of what it takes to make them move, it's really hard. It takes pages of math to write down. I mean, just to move this arm in it like this. And so it's like staggering to me that we have a brain that is far better than any machine in terms of the elegance of its movements.
Yeah.
So and you can't help but wonder, how does it do it?
Yeah. Yeah. Let's get into it. And to your point, even the things with holding the book.
Yeah.
Right? Even something so simple.
Right.
Is really,
it's beautiful, right?
It is.
It's
it
beautiful.
Absolutely is.
So I'll give you another example. So we have now these beautiful phones that you can do all kinds of beautiful videos with. And if you walk around with these phones while you're doing videos, it's really hard to maintain stability. You try to look at the video that you took and try to read the signs of the stores. And it's really hard to look through this to read those signs. But of course, you can walk around all you want with your eyes. You can see it. So why is that? Why is it that this fabulous, iPhone 59 Pro, when I'm walking around with it, it's still hard for me to actually see moving things.
Yeah.
Stable moving and read with it. And the reason is that as I move, there are this links in my body. Every step that I take, there's this little shock that my body feels. I have this inverted pendulum that slightly is moving. At the top of it is my head, and then there are these eyes sitting in there. If you really imagine like the math it takes to maintain stability so that on your fovea, that sign doesn't go up and down like this. It stays stationary. How is that possible? That's another example of stability and how hard it is to actually do it.
Yeah.
And we do it because we have predictive models that every time we hit our foot, we expect certain, motion in our body that eventually gets to our head, gets to our eyes, and then it slightly moves in the opposite direction so that it remains stable.
I mean, this is something that, I'm sure the same for you, but it's always been so apparent to me. It's just how incredible the human body is. And I came at that from biochemistry.
Okay.
So for me, I was doing like protein X-ray crystallography, we're trying to figure out the structure of, one protein at a time, and just really struggling, it was like, and then even when we get the structure, this is back in like 2010, 2013, right? To just model how that one protein would bind to something else, to simulate it,
Right.
it would fall apart.
Because it's a 3D structure.
It's a 3D structure. It has different shapes. They change based on different solutions. Each protein, they've got different conformations, and then the reality is that these are not just two proteins or two molecules interacting in isolation. This is an enormous network of different things in every cell of our body. In a similar way, I learned as I got into biochemistry, man, we really don't understand this.
Well, a good example of it for me is you have a sense of being a unit, right? You feel as one. The analogy for me is like if you ever see a school of fish, if you stand far enough back, it appears to have a purpose. It moves. If something comes at it, it reacts to it.
Right.
It behaves in this emergent way, even though there's no king fish.
Right.
They're just fish. They're the same fish, right? But together, when they become a mass, this population, they appear organized.
Yes.
They appear purposeful.
Right.
even though they're just individual fish. And so that to me is analogy to our brain, to our nervous system to some extent, is that you have all these neurons that are roughly the same. There is no king neuron.
Right.
There is no location where something is controlling everything else. But yet together you get this emergent thing that is that's purposeful. Anyway, it's a beautiful thing to think about and study.
It is. It really is.
How does that happen?
I know. Oh, that's why you're here. So, but I think that's a perfect segue, because that's how in ecological dynamics, that's how we think of the body as that school of fish,
right?
That it's, rather than being controlled by the master fish or the brain, that it's all of these components. The brain is an important central organism, and we lesion parts of the brain and the whole thing falls apart, right? You lose your brain, you're done immediately. But the intelligence of the organism or of the school of fish emerges more from the interactions of the components, rather than a central controller. And so I think this is the really interesting difference between the two fields of, like, how much is the brain controlling and predicting and organizing what everything is going to do, versus playing an important role in combination with many other, important tissues and the environment to, actualize goal-directed behavior.
Right. So let's begin with the concept of goal-directed behavior, and then let's show that there is no program that is producing something, and that the concept of a program is not really well fitted to the data, but rather the concept of perhaps an algorithm would be a better way to think about how something is being produced.
And when you say program, just to pause for a second, you're talking about schema theory, generalized motor programs, or
no, I'm thinking more in terms of the way you might imagine a sequence of motor commands that have been somehow pre-written someplace. That's going to be produced. And I think the more correct way of thinking about it is to begin with saying I have a goal. The goal is a longer term representation of what I want to achieve,
right,
than what I need to do to achieve that goal. So suppose you're a fish, and the reason why I want to talk about fish again is because development of the brain and development of fish are intimately tied. So development of the jaw made it so that about 600 million years ago, that fish became predators. They weren't just sucking things. They were shooting toward things and biting things. Now, to become a predator, you have to be able to coordinate your motion so that you're going to be at a place where something else is going to be. And you're going to have to learn to understand your environment in terms of what are these other things are going to do, because I have to be at a location where I believe something else is going to be so I can eat it.
Right.
And this is, of course, true for birds. All predators have to be able to predict these things and understand their environment. So the locomotion became a lot more complicated, because now you have to maneuver your body rapidly to get to some location. You have to coordinate your mouth opening with the motion of your body. You have to coordinate your breathing so that you can't bite and breathe at the same time. So then you have to swallow. It's a whole lot of things that changes when you move from I'm just doing this and just sucking in water to no, I'm going to go and bite at something.
Yeah.
And that thing doesn't like me to bite it. It's going to try to get away. That coordination was, I think, the central thing that went along with development of the jaw. That's when now you get these structures, the cerebellum, the cerebral cortex, they begin to develop together to allow for this coordination. And it begins with the notion of goal. I want to be at some location in order to do something. But how I get there is going to be all dependent on moment-to-moment updating of what my environment is doing. There is no program that I can rely on, right? But I have a goal. This links to concepts in optimality and control theory. So if you think about it, the simplest movement, an eye movement. I'm here, eye movements are kind of like interceptive movements as well. You make a really rapid eye movement to a location. It takes 40 milliseconds to get there, but then you have to get there and you have to be stable. So if the thing is moving, you have to make your eye movement so that it gets to what you want to look at as it's moving. If you're watching a plane, if you're watching a dancer across the stage, you need to move your eye rapidly to get there. Now, that's the goal, to get to some location. You have to think about it in terms of some form of optimality, which says, I want to be at this location with some accuracy, and I want to presumably be as efficient as I can in terms of the effort that I take to do it. And then there's now the concept of how important is it for you, which is the concept of value. This comes from economics, meaning that if I'm moving my eye to some location because I want to look at a face, that's more valuable than if I want to move my eye to the same location, but maybe it's a chair.
Yeah.
So how much does the movement that you're making has a value for you? That's something that a component of our brain is going to assign. It's going to choose from among this environmental system that I'm in, the action that I want to perform, and there's going to be a value associated with it. Okay, that value is going to determine a component of this cost, meaning how important is this for me to do it in terms of, for example, how fast should I move? How much time should I take to get there? So I have a notion of accuracy. I have a notion of effort that I should spend to get there. If it's valuable to me, I should spend a lot of effort to get there. Perhaps I should get there quickly, spend energy to get there. Then comes the problem, okay, how are you going to do this? That has to be translated. That goal, that cost, is going to have to be translated to the actual body that has to do it. And as I'm doing it, then there has to be interaction with my environment. I get feedback. Am I progressing toward my goal? Did my goal change? Is it still likely for me to get to my goal? So there is no program, because the goals are moment to moment changing. The costs are moment to moment changing. The way you feel about this world, this environment, is moment to moment changing. The problem becomes, how do I translate my long-term goals into short-term changes in behavior?
I want to try to emphasize a lot of the empirical work, because I feel like that's where we can really find a lot of common ground and like foundation to build out of. And so, of course, I agree with you, but empirically, what to you is the best evidence that we're not using those programs?
Right. So I like the idea of using the simplest movement that we make about as often as is possible. And those are eye movements. We move our eyes. We're visual animals. We make two saccades per second. Saccades are these rapid eye movements. So when you're reading, for example, you make saccades. When you're looking at me, you make saccades. When you're looking at this environment, we make about 2 of those every second of our waking life.
Wow.
It is about as stereotypical of a movement as you can imagine. I mean, you would think about it. If there's any movement that you have done you've done more saccades than you've done breaths. You've done more saccades than you've done heartbeats in your awake life. So, okay, let's start with that, because it gives me an idea. It gives me an example of a movement that you should be really good at. I mean, my God, you couldn't practice a movement more than this, right? Okay. Yet, if you look at the way we make saccades, if you actually measure it, first of all, what you notice is that you make saccades that have a velocity profile that are probably different than mine. Second, you notice that when you're a teenager, your saccades are a heck of a lot faster than when you get older. So why? Why is that? And then there is this notion that even your state of your brain, in terms of how much do you value, what is it that you're going to be looking at? So as I mentioned, suppose you're going to be looking at a face. You're making a saccade to look at a face, versus you're making a saccade to look at, a chair. That small difference in the value that your brain assigns to the face will make your saccade velocity slightly higher or slightly lower. Will make your variance of the accuracy of the eye movement slightly better or slightly worse. So the value that you assign to the goal influences how you move. And the value that you assign is a dynamic thing.
And so how have we seen that? That's you ask people to like self-report?
No, you first of all, anytime you open a web page, you should pay attention to the first thing you look at. Why? Because that tells you something about the value system of your brain. What does it value? Probably things that, for the reason why web pages have pictures of women is because we as a species value that more. That's what the first thing we look at. Right. No matter if you're a man or woman. So that gives you something about the value system. Anyway, my point being that there is no such thing as a stereotypical movement.
Right.
Because the way you move is a reflection of how you value your goal. Another example of this. You arrive at the airport. As you're walking out, if you see your wife, your girlfriend, your brother, your sister, you're going to move rapidly toward them. But if there's a guy out there waiting for you with a sign in their arm, well, you're not going to run toward them. So these are these low-level ways with which the value of our destination affects the way we move toward it. And so we have to incorporate that into how the movement is going to be generated.
Yeah.
So, and the idea, going back to the notion of optimal control, is that what that says is that the cost that I'm willing to pay in terms of energy is higher if I'm moving towards something that I like. I will naturally run toward people I love, but not toward other people.
Right.
I don't have to force myself to spend more energy.
As far as the research that's shown that, it's generally like you give people faces versus chairs.
Right.
And you see the eye movements are faster and more accurate for the thing that they should value more.
Yeah, and you can also teach that, meaning that if suppose that you give arbitrary, visual stimuli. There's like, some fractal image here, another fractal image, but then you learn through experience, oh, this fractal image is going to give me more money. And then you'll see that the eye movements toward the things that they value more just naturally becomes faster. It's a simple way to understand the way we value things. Movements, I mean, that goes without saying, right? You should pay attention to how people move, especially towards you, because it says what they think about you. It says how they value you implicitly. This is how we tell each other how we feel about each other. It's through our movements.
Let's get into like how those movements are coordinated.
Right. Okay. So I brought this up as a preamble to tell you that we used to think that there's a part of our brain that is involved in cognitive things, valuation, decision making. Then there's this older, simpler part of the brain that controls movements. Well, I think that's nonsense. I just gave you all these examples to tell you there's no such thing as separation of one from the other. That our movements belie how we value our destination. We always are moving because there's a purpose to it. And that purpose is a reflection of how we value the world around us. It's one of the most interesting lines of research, in my opinion, right now in motor control, that tries to ask this link between how we value things and how we move things. And what is the neural basis of that? We don't really understand. It has something to do with dopamine, it seems like. Because dopamine, whereas it's thought to be reflecting how we learn to assign value, in order for you to move, you also appear to be releasing dopamine, which is really interesting because it says the act of movement is releasing these neurotransmitters that seem to give us some sense of pleasure. Just the act of movement, which goes along to say, you don't need to ask me if I'm depressed. You just look at me the way I move. You can tell that I'm depressed. So when you're not feeling well, when you're not cognitively spry, the way you move is a reflection of that state.
Yeah.
So you move slower.
Right.
You don't want to get out of bed. You don't have the energy. And again, you see this link between movements and the state of our brain.
Yeah. I want to understand optimal feedback control.
Okay. Optimal feedback control comes from the idea of playing games. mathematics of it begin with the notion that, let's say I'm playing tic-tac-toe or backgammon or chess. I have a long-term goal.
Right.
I want to win the game. Then there are these intermediate steps that have to do with interaction with the environment in which I'm in. You're playing tic-tac-toe with your child, let's say, and you have a board in front of you, and the board describes the states. So you have these 9 places, and then you have 2 things you could do, an X and an O. And so you begin with some idea of what might be the best place and the best action. And so you perform that action. But the goal is this long-term goal of winning the game. When I perform an action, the environment, in this case the other person, is going to perform their action. The state changes. The available actions for me change. Now I have another action to perform, but the goal remains the same. Optimal control, what it does is to say that I will give you a policy that will allow you to determine what is the best action at any given state. You can't predict those states because it depends on what the other person does. But no matter what they do, they will put me at a state that I have this policy that tells me what to do at that state. In a way, the concept of a policy is like the golden rule. It's like what your mother taught you. It's like the 10 Commandments. What they're trying to do is to optimize something about your life.
Yeah.
You don't know what's going to happen in your life, but if you have a policy, the golden rule, the 10 Commandments, whatever, that describes what to do in states that you haven't seen before, it gives you a way to perform an action. Suppose that you have a long-term goal of retiring in Bahamas. Today you find yourself as a poor student in Reza's class. And so you ask yourself a question, is this a good thing for me getting to retire in Bahamas? And so that's what optimal control will allow you to do. You say, okay, if that's your goal.
Calculating the value of what is the most likely action, and how likely will this get me to the Bahamas?
Exactly. And if you think about it, eventually the mathematics of optimal control will be so good that presumably it will tell us how to do anything, any long-term goal. Reinforcement learning is a way to do optimal control, is a way to have machines play games with each other and from each other's actions learn, oh, I'm at this state. If I want to win the game, this is the best action to do. So the idea is that our brain, when it attempts to perform a simple movement, what it's trying to do is to have a long-term goal. This is what I want to achieve. I want to move to this location. I want to travel to that place. But I am now at this state. I'm not anywhere close to that. I'm at this state. What's the best thing that I can do now? Move this way, move this part, do this action in order to produce the final thing that I want. And that final thing will be something that will evaluate all the things that I did and ask, was this the most efficient way to get there? Did you do it with the least amount of effort? And if so, then okay, good job. But if not, let's fix the part that okay, so how does optimal control work? Optimal control works by saying that every action that you do is based on evaluating the state that you're in and the environment. So here's my body state, here's the environment state. I'm going to respond to that in such a way that I think is the best possible thing that I can do in the long-term goal of achieving what I want.
Bahamas.
Yeah, Bahamas. Exactly. Should I marry this person? Should I take this class? Should I go into that, coffee shop? Is that going to help me? And that's what optimal control attempts to do. Help you achieve long-term goals by giving you policies so you can, in the long term, achieve them.
Can you talk about some of the experiments you've done? I know there's a big kind of force field one was a big deal. I'm sure you've done a lot of different research.
Right. So, okay, let me tell you about the ideas behind motor control and adaptation. When I was taking courses on robotics, what you learn about robotics is that, these machines are going to have these things that are going to hold things, they're going to move them around, and every time they grab something, well, that's going to change the dynamics of the robot arm. So the forces that have to be produced by these motors here have to be different to move this mass than this other mass. All right. You can have algorithms that learn those things. And the question is, all right, this brain has this arm, And at the end of it is this hand. It seems like it's designed to hold things, right? But every time you hold something, that thing that you're holding changes the mass of your arm.
Right.
So suppose that you have a can of Coke that you've drank a little bit and you put it into the fridge. All right, I put my can of Coke in the fridge. It's almost full. But my partner goes, while I'm not looking, drinks half of it. Okay, so now if I go and open the fridge door and I go to pick up that can, I will show you that my brain predicted that it would be almost full. Why? Because it lifts up more than it would if it was full. So the idea being that I have in my head a model of how much Coke I had left behind in that can.
Yeah.
And that next time I go to pick it up, I know how much to hold it, how high to lift it. And if somebody has drank some of it, you will see it in the way I move.
Right.
That prediction error.
And just like with the book, very quickly, when you start lifting it, my hand moves up and then stabilizes.
Yes.
Right.
Yes. So I'm not going to be unstable in this, but you're going to see that there's going to be slight error in my movement because I predicted that it would be full. Okay, so now how do we do experiments about this? Because it's interesting. So where is this model of the can of Coke in my head? And how was it learned? So how do we do experiments? Well, we don't want to do experiments with cans of Coke. We want to do it, much more formally. So what I thought about is that imagine that you could simulate the dynamics of this object with another robot. So you sit and there's this robot here and has a handle and you hold the handle of this robot. And this robot is going to produce for you the dynamics of this object that you think that you want to hold. So can of Coke or soup or whatever, some other dynamics. And so now I can't tell by looking at the robot what is going to be its dynamics, right? Because it's just a robot. But as soon as I begin moving it, it does something to my arm. So it's this machine that's generating some forces. I see. So I've tried to go from here to here, but this machine has some dynamics, some forces that are velocity dependent that sort of pushes me like this. I see. Okay, so that's not good. I don't want to get pushed like this. My brain slowly learns to predict what the robot is doing and just compensates for it. Like learning to compensate for the dynamics that is that can of Coke. So now we have a paradigm to study learning. Simple ways of studying learning. So the first question we asked is that, okay, people learn this. It doesn't take them very long to realize that there is some force there. And what happens is that soon they don't even feel the forces anymore. After 300-400 movements like this, even though the motion now has returned to more or less a straight movement, I don't even know that. I can't tell you if the robot is producing forces. As soon as the robot doesn't produce a force, now I have that after effect, like that can of Coke. My hand moves up because I expected the forces to be there. My hand moves in the opposite direction because I expect the forces of the robot to be there. I only feel it if it's different than what I expected.
With this model, it's not necessarily that it's like that the brain is consciously computing.
It's not conscious. Okay, so let's talk about consciousness. Okay, so a beautiful example of this was a patient named HM, Henry. Okay, so we took our robot down to Henry's place, and
you did work with him?
Yes.
Oh my gosh!
Yes.
This is a big deal too.
So Henry is one of the most important patients in the field of neuroscience because he had a surgery when he was in his early 20s for intractable epilepsy that he had. The surgeon, Scoville was his name. This is in the 50s now, 1950s, took out both sides of his hippocampus. And that made it so that his epilepsy was resolved. He didn't have these episodic scenarios anymore. But what happened was that Brenda Milner, who was studying Henry, discovered that he had this terrible amnesia. So he wasn't able to recollect the fact that 5 minutes ago, I saw you. 5 minutes ago, we had a conversation. 5 minutes ago, I walked into that room and I saw that picture. So these short-term memories were gone. Henry remembered where he was born, much of what happened to him in his life up until he had the surgery, but the ability to form new memories was lost in him. Okay, so now we want to know, can Henry learn this task? And if so, what does he think about it? You know, can he tell me something about it? Okay, so this was one of the first experiments that I did when I became a professor at Hopkins. Me and my students put our robot in my wife's station wagon. We went to MIT, and they brought Henry, and Sue Corkin was the professor that was working with Henry at the time. So they brought Henry from, I think he was staying at a place in Rhode Island, I believe. Anyway, they brought him to the room where we had set up our robot. Okay, so now if you imagine you have this room where you have this robot sitting there, and actually on the robot was a sticker that said Johns Hopkins. Okay, so Henry comes. Henry's in a wheelchair, so he is at the time, I think it was in his late 70s, and his nurse brings him to the room, and I say, hello, Henry, nice to meet you, and so forth. And then there's a chair that's sitting in front of this robot. And again, the robot is just this arm, this mechanical arm, basically. And so I ask him to sit in front of the robot. So he does. And so just like everybody, when I ask him to hold on to the handle of the robot, he holds on to the handle, but he's just looking at his hand and he's moving it around like this. I said, no, look up at this monitor. This monitor has this, the cursors and things. This is now early 90s. And he looks up at that, and he sees when he moves this, the cursor moves on the monitor. Okay, he learns this association. And next what we do is that we give him targets to move. So we say, okay, now move the robot handle from here to here. So he moves it from here to here, move to here, here, and he does that. And then as he learns to make these movements, then we give him the force field. So the force field is making it so that the same movement that he wanted to do, like this, now it gets pushed. And as he does this, every time he does the movement well, he gets to the target and there's this little explosion. So this primitive graphics. So in order to give him feedback, we give him this explosion that says, good job, that was a good movement. That triggers a memory in him. He says, when I was a kid, I would go in my backyard and I had this gun and I would love to shoot birds. And he would tell me about the gun that he had. He had a Remington or something, and the kind of birds that he would shoot. And the sentence would last, the little conversation would last about 2 minutes. Then he would be silent. Then, when I was a kid, I would go to my backyard and I had this gun, and it was astonishing. We had a 2-day experiment with Henry, and he must have repeated that joyful experience associated with being a kid and those explosions. I don't know, every 7-10 minutes we heard the same story. Okay, anyway, it was a good example of what it's like, not to have this thing that forms long-term memories. Another useful thing for you to know is that for his age, he was remarkably young looking. And I thought that also probably is a useful thing because he probably doesn't have any anxiety. He doesn't feel any long-term memories, so he doesn't have anything to worry about. He had no wrinkles. So now we take a break. So after this is taken about an hour, and he goes back to his chair. His nurse takes him away to maybe give him a drink or something, give him a piece of food perhaps. After the break, he comes back. And it's been maybe an hour since he's left. And I ask him, Henry, hi, do you remember me? And he says, no. And I ask him, do you remember this machine that you might have interacted with? And he said, no, I don't remember that. But he gets out of his chair. He sits down in front of the robot. Now, you can imagine the robot has this arm thing here, and I push the robot arm aside so he can sit in his chair. He grabs the robot arm, he brings it in front of him, he looks up to the monitor as he moves it around. So what that tells me is that despite the fact that he doesn't have a conscious memory of what he did, there's a part of his brain that remembers what is this about, not just how to move, but what is this thing about, this experience about, and that it must have been a good experience for him because he would never otherwise touch it. If I had shocked him while he was experiencing this, he would not remember perhaps getting shocked, but he would also not want to interact with that thing. Subconsciously, he wouldn't value. But now he had assigned a value to it and he liked it and he knew what to do. He moved it around. And just like that Coke can that we, don't know that it's not full anymore. So a hand goes like this. The robot wasn't producing forces. So the first movement he makes, he has the after effect of the way the robot forces were. So a part of his brain is remembering this machine has these forces that it produces. I am now moving that machine. It should still be producing those forces, but it's not. So now it has the after effects. And I can see that even without conscious recollection, there's a part of his brain that remembers how to do the task.
It's so incredible. Yeah. And yeah, as we were just talking about a little, like, it must be very cool to have contributed such an important,
Well, it increases my love of the brain. It's so interesting to not be aware of what you know. That is a part of your brain that knows how to do this, but you're not aware of it. You just get in front of it and it knows how to do it. And it's in this case is an example of a simple task that the brain learned, and despite the fact that the person has no memory of learning it, ever seeing this machine before, and all of that, and yet it knows how to do it.
That to me always stood out as a very interesting thing I would notice, I think mostly with athletes, where I've just noticed so consistently that very skilled athletes, they can do a thing and they can do the thing really well. But when you ask them what they did, they really, I don't want to say they struggle to tell you what they did, but they rarely will tell you accurately. Like they very often will very obviously not tell you what they actually did or tell you something different or not understand what they're doing. And to me, that was a pretty strong, consistent experiential evidence of what we're doing is not really controlled at a conscious level.
Right. Yeah. I think that, and one can ask the question, why? Why is there's this separation? So what we learned over the years is that the part of the brain that's central for the task that I just described for you, learning of how to move this robot, was the cerebellum. People that had cerebellar deficits couldn't learn it. They would remember that I've seen this robot. They would remember that they had interacted with it, but they couldn't form those models that I was describing for you, that they would be able to control the forces that this machine was producing. And recall it after they had learned it, recall it motorically in how they learned it. And so the cerebellum is one of those parts of our brain that if you get damage to it or for some reason they would have to remove large parts of it, you don't lose consciousness. It's not like your ability to your conscious being isn't reduced because of this part is gone. So the cerebellum is interesting. There are more neurons in the cerebellum than the rest of the brain combined.
Really?
Something like 80% of all neurons in our brain is in the cerebellum. But it's not a part of the brain that we think of as being have much to do with our sense of consciousness. On the one hand, it's central for learning certain things. It contributes to many aspects of decision-making, cognitive processes, but it's not like a place where if you were to lose it, the fundamental being that you are won't change. Your personality won't change. And I think it says that there's a part of our brain that is pretty important for those unconscious things that we do, like some of what athletes do. I would say, I don't know for sure, but I would guess that much of what we do as elegant movements, whether it be what a professional athlete does, what a ballerina does, and just simply existing as a human being that appears to move correctly, which is also a very difficult thing to do. Those things have a lot to do with what the structure of the cerebellum is computing.
So to you, does that mean that these policies are stored in the cerebellum?
No, I don't think so. No. The concept of policies and how they interact with movements, we have no idea where they are. And I doubt that there's one place. And I think what we've learned about the interactions between the cerebellum and the motor cortex and the basal ganglia is that they all make a contribution to this computation that becomes a movement. And the hard thing has been to understand, well, what does it add? What does each component that may come the total add? And that's been the difficult question. But what's becoming clear is that damage to any of these areas would alter the behavior. But there's no place where the policy is somehow gone. Of course, significant damage, for example, to the motor cortex will, as in a stroke, well, it could give you paralysis, it could give you weakness. Those are pretty important things in us humans. Damage to a place like the cerebellum will alter the way you would normally do the task. Like, for example, make it so that you can't learn certain things anymore. Your movements become uncoordinated. You have these symptoms associated with cerebellar disease, but you don't become paralyzed. It's not that you can't do the task. And so, coming back to your question,
even if you completely lose the cerebellum, or
so it's hard to know what that would be like.
Yeah.
There used to be experiments in monkeys that actually did that. Cerebellectomy, you would completely remove the cerebellum, and you would see disorganization of movements, but they wouldn't be like, they're not paralyzed.
Yeah.
We now think that it would alter cognitive processes like decision making. It would alter movements that individuals make. It would alter some forms of impulsivity and control
the
of
vigor.
It would have perhaps affect your vigor. It would also control. The damage to cerebellum will probably also alter how you're willing to control the time that you spent before actions are performed, waiting to do something, holding back, delaying things. That's associated with impulsivity, probably. How it does it, we don't know.
Yeah, science is so fascinating. I always love. There's a quote from my first professor, mentor, that he would always say, the larger the island of knowledge, the larger the shore of uncertainty.
Beautiful. Yeah. So the goal is to add a tiny bit of truth to the sum total of human knowledge. That's what we hope to do. This analogy that I have in my head is that you imagine the sum total of human knowledge as this balloon, and every graduate student with their PhD is just trying to just nudge this edge of this balloon a little further out, and add a little something. And if we're lucky, then what we add is some bit of truth. And if it's really the truth, it's forever.
Okay, so I want to try to explain some of ecological dynamics to you, and hopefully I'll do an okay job, and get your take on it, because I think that'd be really exciting. We've got 6 kind of fundamental principles that I really like to boil it down to. This is from Robert Gray. So the first one is direct perception. So the idea is that we don't use internal model, and that instead we're interacting, rather than like interacting with the environment through the mediation of a representation or a model, that we're interacting with the environment directly and interfacing with the environment directly. And then what we're perceiving is predominantly our opportunities for action. So we call those affordances. And this is mainly from the work of James Gibson, Eleanor Gibson.
So an analogy to that would be a web page where you have a bunch of images and some text, and each of them afford an action. They want our attention. They want our gaze to be directed toward them. And the way I think about it is that our brain evaluates the possibilities, assigns a winner. At this moment in time, I'm going to direct my action toward this element in what this environment is presenting. And then after I acquired information there, I look to see what else is there. I can go there. And it's a way I like to think about foraging. You have forest. You have something nearby. You go try it out. You consume something. Then you move on to the next available resource.
At some level, like the stuff is happening, right? And I think what we're trying to do is put theories to how it's happening. So I think for us, we would say like maybe the web page, these affordances, they're inviting,
Yeah.
right? Like that each
Yeah.
image invites,
Yes.
the possibility of looking at.
Yeah, because you
right?
can only look at one thing at a time.
Right.
And the value that your brain assigns dictates the order in which you make that.
Yeah.
Each is a choice that you're making.
So I think the way we would think about that is like rather than the value being because pretty clearly, like you do the thing, right? You put the images on the screen.
People
are
look at it.
very going to look
There's
at
a
one,
sequence.
right? And
Yeah.
like you've said and you've shown, like people are going to look faster towards certain things, or they might look more accurately
Yes.
towards those things that
Yes.
they value more. But we could also think about that as like, is that value is assigned in the brain, or is it like something about the way the body interacts with that? It essentially functionally looks like it's valued more, but it's maybe more like the intrinsic dynamics of how your whole system is in that moment, in that continuous flow of time, guides you more towards that thing.
So when you go to a grocery store, you have many choices.
Yeah.
Imagine you're standing in front of in an aisle. You're looking at jams, let's say.
Yeah.
There's a range of jams. Okay. So the way your attention is directed toward things has to do with things like color, how they stand out, the size,
Yeah.
their contrast with respect to what's behind them, and the choice that you're going to make and what you're going to look at, and eventually what you're going to buy, depends on, did something stand out? Did it grab your attention? Now, if you don't have a whole lot of time, the context in which you're making that choice is going to alter how you make that choice. Obviously, you're going to be more influenced by superficial things that are there.
Yeah.
Did it stand out? Did it grab my attention? But if you have more time, then you're going to look maybe at the ingredients and so forth. And so the way you're going to move with respect to this option is going to be these values. These values are going to be something that you're going to initially be just based on superficial nature of what stands out visually against this background. What is it placed at? Things that are down at the bottom, it's going to be harder for you to look at them because, you're going to have to bend your body to look at it or look high. It's more effortful to do those things. But maybe those are the ones that you're going to eventually find are more valuable, but you're going to have to spend effort to get them.
Should we go to...
Tell me more.
That's direct perception.
So the way I think about direct perception is that some of it is just intrinsic properties of the elements in my environment with respect to their background, contrast, color, blah, blah, blah. Some things stand out.
Yeah. So for us, it's like, it's not exactly, there's intrinsic characteristics of, the jar at the store.
Sure.
And then there's intrinsic characteristics of you at that time. And are you hungry? You have like a lot of money that you want to spend, or
Right.
not a lot of money that
Time.
you want to spend. All those.
Yeah.
all those
Evaluated with
things.
respect to what's available to you. Yeah.
And then it's about the interaction of those things. And that's where the affordance is. It's in the interaction and the complex, rather than it's stored in the brain and in the values that the brain has assigned.
Well, when you walk into a room,
Yeah.
suppose you walk into a party.
Yeah.
Okay. There are certain things that are going to you're going to orient your body toward because they're going to attract your attention. And that's going to be based on, again, a value system that your brain has about things that I'm interested in looking at.
Right.
And that initial reaction is based on a superficial representation of things that are out there. Dress colors, height, interesting, coordinated or uncoordinated things that I look at. But it's going to be depending on how you as a human being value and learn value in your experience. And then maybe somehow you recognize someone you know.
Right.
So that's going to change your value.
Right.
Okay, so that's going to come later. And that recognition is going to attract your attention. That's going to, in the world of affordances, your action here is orienting yourself toward it.
Mm-hmm.
And that orientation is going to, again, be a reflection of your instantaneous valuation of the what's in that room.
Yeah, and I think there is potentially space there for, it's like we think of Newell's model, right? I'm sure like you're familiar, like the interacting constraints of the individual, the environment, and the task, right? What is the person trying? Yeah, they're trying to get food, and then
Right. If you're hungry, if there's a buffet there,
right,
it's going to be different for you.
right. I think there's potentially for space within those individual constraints. If we think about it like that, how is a person going to interact? What are they going to buy? What are they going to look at when they're in the store?
Or not look at, right?
Or not look at.
So again, thinking about this room with people in it. Suppose I walk in and I see. So suppose it's you. You see your fiance.
Mm.
It's going to attract your attention. You're going to orient toward her, perhaps even move toward her. But maybe you also see someone you don't care for.
Yeah.
Then you're going to move perhaps in a way that will orient you away from that person.
Yeah.
There could be things that you see, there's this landscape.
Yeah.
And there's going to be peaks and there's going to be troughs.
Yes. Yeah. And so we call those attractors and repellers.
Good.
Right.
And that'll be reflected. And then this is what it comes back to. It's so important to me. If you really want to know something about individuals, look at how they move. You know, if you care about, I want to know, does this person like me or not? Look at how they move towards you, they move away from you. It's so simple. And I don't know if it's true, of course, but it would be the subconscious way that we have to link the value system to the motor system.
And that is something you see in like more, I want to say like simple research, but like more constrained research that like, you know, you have a face and people look towards it faster.
Yes.
And I assume you've done things on like in the reaching tasks that the people are reaching towards.
People have done that. Yeah, people have looked at reaching tasks and value and also effort. Effort is a component of this as well. So if something is effortful, if orienting toward them is effortful, or moving toward them is effortful, or whatever action that I have to do to acquire that state that I'm interested in, if it's effortful, then it better be worth my while.
Right.
It better be valuable for me. And so when I mentioned to you that when I'm looking at the aisle of jam, the fact that a jam is at the bottom or at the top, that's more effortful for me. And so it's going to be unlikely for me to look at it. But if I do, then perhaps it's because I have time or something has made it so that I'm going to actually forage in a way that's appropriate for actually catching the value.
Yeah. Let me keep going through it.
All right. Do it.
So next one, direct learning. Are you familiar with Jacobs and Michaels?
No.
2007? They did some really cool experiments. They had people look at colliding balls.
Okay.
So there's the mass ratio, and they're asking people, you know, to perceive the mass ratio of the different balls. And then the idea is that there's a mass specifying invariant, there's exit speed difference, and scatter angle difference.
So like, physics.
Yeah, like basically the idea is like, what variables could people be paying attention to figure out the mass ratios? Like,
so is the objective to guess which one is heavier? Is that what's the
question?
Yeah,
so like, you know, imagine like, two balls and one's really big, and then, you know, you see on the screen that they move towards each other.
Yep. And
then, I don't know if this one really flies that way very quickly. And then I ask you at the end, how heavy was this, B as opposed to A?
Okay.
So you could look at the exit speed difference, and you could look at the difference in scatter angle, like where they go.
Okay.
So they had like an information space where there's like exit speed, scatter angle. And then here is like, basically they said it's a linear combination that they could be paying attention to. So the idea with direct perception is we can represent perception at a level of coarseness where you're perceiving a single higher order informational variable. So basically what they're looking at is like, they're trying to show how do we do that if we do it. There's one thing that's going to feed into perception, right? So, there's like higher order variable, right? That's made up of mass specifying invariant, exit speed difference, and scatter angle difference. And like these, you could represent these as a combination.
Okay.
So you could say like, the sum of these equals 1.
Okay.
You could pay attention to a 1 combination of this. So it could be like 30% mass specifying environment, and then 70% exit speed difference and 0% scatter angle difference, or any combination of that adds up to 1. And then you guess what are those mass ratios.
Okay.
And so based on how they did it, you're able to like correlate. This is a perfect variable. Like it would correlate perfectly with the mass ratios. And then depending on which collisions they showed you, basically they could make one of these useless. Like one of these doesn't correlate at all, and the other one does a little.
I see.
And then so you can see, and then now what happens is as you show them the collisions, now you can see what do they pay attention to over time. Like you can guess which variables they're using, and you can see how that changes over the trials.
I see.
And then so what they're saying and what they showed seems to happen is that learning can happen directly in what is that variable? Like what combination of these are we paying attention to?
So the idea, if I understand it correctly, is that through manipulating the reliability of how a variable is going to be relevant to the mass ratio that you want me to predict, people learn to ignore or use that variable.
Yes.
Okay.
Differently.
Okay.
Yeah. And so what they were suggesting is that learning can happen directly through experience.
Yes.
Rather than updating an internal model. Like that was the idea is, again, you don't actually like show that, right?
Okay.
But they show that the perceptual learning is happening.
Right.
And then they suggest that, oh, this is a way that this could happen without an internal model. Really.
I see.
You could say like, here is where your policy is, right? And you could update your policy.
Right.
But instead, we could say, well, and there's a second part of this that I'll mention in a second. But instead, you can just say, oh, we pay attention to a different variable. We update, like if you pay attention to the exit speed difference, that's a form of perceptual learning.
Right.
If you're not storing that, really, you're storing maybe that you're going to look for that in the situation, but fundamentally, that's not really like an updated storage. It's an updated how you interact with that environment to perceive more skillfully.
Okay. So the framework that I think about in this case is a mechanism by which there are multiple sensory channels, each providing you with some information. Then there's uncertainty associated with the validity of each channel.
Yes.
And that the ultimate goal is to use these sources of information in terms of both the value that they provide you and the uncertainty that you have associated with the accuracy of that value to then form a belief about the reality of the scenario. And so to formalize this concept mathematically, the way you would think about it is that you've learned to make decisions based on uncertainties and the observed initial value that you have in a particular channel. So if I see that, an angle or SA, ES, MSI, each of these variables, I have a sample of what I just saw. So I have a measurement, but I also have an uncertainty associated with my measurement, which says how unsure I am that measurement is going to be relevant to the thing that I want to eventually compute. So that provides a mechanism by which to combine variables that involve both a measure of their value and your measure of uncertainty associated with that value. And the way that this is done, for example, is one way is through Bayesian integration is one form of it. And in the motor system, as well as in the perceptual system, that form of decision making, perceptual decision making, Bayesian way, there are good papers on this. So, for example, Daniel Wolpert and Conrad Kurting had championed this about 20 years ago to describe you don't store if you will, a value associated with each of these and an uncertainty. You learn how uncertain you should be about this. How reliable is something? And then if that channel provides you with a piece of information, you're going to weigh it with regard to the uncertainty. You learn the uncertainty. You learn the reliability of that channel And then when that channel provides you with a piece of information, you combine that with the uncertainty that you've learned, that becomes your posterior, as it's called. This is how I'm going to use that piece of information.
Is the posterior the same as a prior?
So the prior is your beliefs about how the world should behave. This is what you've experienced, and that prior includes uncertainties associated with the world. On the one hand, my priors tell me that how an experience that I perform. So say I perform an action. What should be the consequence of that? That's a prior. That prior involves both what should happen and the uncertainty that I have about what should happen.
Right.
When I acquire a piece of information, I have a prior belief about what should I see. So when you go to pick up that can, your prior belief is the weight in there. Your uncertainty is how likely is it that my partner came and drank some out of it. So that two things dictate how I will now interact with this as I lift it up. And if the prior belief matches what I experience, then I have no error. And it's perfectly as I predicted. If it's different, then I have a prediction error. That becomes how I update my model. But the prediction error depends on your uncertainty regarding, do you believe what you just felt? Is this a random occurring, or is this something important? Should I pay attention to that? And if it's coming from a channel that's unreliable, then I'm really not going to learn it. But if it's coming from a channel that's usually reliable, then I am going to pay attention to it, and I'm going to update next time I interact with it.
Do I remember some experiment with fog where they're asking to perceive things, and then they added fog? And
yeah. So any piece of information that you get can be clouded, making it uncertain, or robust, where it really stands out against it. But in addition to that, we naturally build prior beliefs about reliability of pieces of information. And so I can't provide you with a truth in the context of just the void. So that comes from the mouth of somebody. And if you have a prior belief that this is a reliable source, then you're going to act differently than if you believe that it's, it's unreliable. And that's the notion of uncertainty and how you interact with sensory feed.
Yeah.
So, in a way, the fact that we don't feel our clothes. So our clothes are on us. They rub against us as we move, right? But it's astonishing that we don't feel it, right? But yet, if you have a tiny pebble in your shoe, tiny pebble, you can't walk for more than a couple of feet before I got to stop and take this out. And despite the fact that all of this stuff is on your feet, your body, you feel it all the time, but we don't actually feel it. Why? Because it's exactly what we would predict that should happen. If, on the other hand, there was a tiny bug that was in my shirt, or maybe a pin that was in my shirt that I didn't know about it, as soon as I moved, I would feel it. But not if it isn't there and all I feel is what I normally should have against me.
If you'd be interested, I'd love to set up something else with maybe someone more knowledgeable than me, and then have you guys have a discussion. It would be so interesting.
I have a good friend, John Krakauer, who's one of the most knowledgeable, most eloquent, and he's a neurologist as well. So he knows a heck of a lot about movement. He loves movement, but he also knows about damage to the neural circuitry and how it affects movements. And I enjoy talking with him because I learned so much from him.
Yeah, amazing.
Okay, what's S?
S is self-organization.
Is that like the school of fish?
Exactly like the school of fish. So the idea is that the body in coordinating movement is functioning, and particularly the brain is not functioning as a central controller. But if we think of it more, there's a process of self-organization where basically you have a non-equilibrium system where the behavior of the system emerges from the characteristics and interactions of the subunits. So that's like crystal formation, a school of fish, a flock of birds, where there's all these different systems where we clearly see this emergent thing, exactly what
An
you're saying.
emergent computation.
Intelligent behavior is
Yeah.
clearly happening, and there is no, central controller in sight.
Yeah. I mean, that is the fundamental question of neuroscience, in my opinion, is to understand how does a system made up of largely independent units that are connected in some small way to the local neighborhoods produce this incredible thing that we see. I am forming thoughts. I am moving my tongue. I am breathing in and out, making this sound that you're hearing. And when you realize that that's just a school of fish, that all the fish are the same, and somehow they're moving in this weird way that's making that happen, without a central controller, right? Without anything like that, with just a circuitry that allows it to happen. And there was no architect that somehow placed those things there, so that it wasn't like a computer CPU or something that some group of people designed it to be that way. It just became that way over the millions of years of slowly changing to become this coherent master of the universe.
I mean, and this is the thing, right? Because it seems to me, and it sounds like you agree, that self-organization is clearly a thing in the human body in so many ways, but also, in the nervous system and in the brain. Like neurons are like, you can very easily model them as coupled oscillators, and you get a bunch of them together, and like that's what coupled oscillators do. They self-organize. And so one idea is, I think, and I'd love to hear your take on this, that if the brain was using something like motor programs or some sort of prediction or optimization, that it would be not through like hard-coded, this neuron means this neuron means, this finger and this motor unit is going to activate, but rather that like this emergent behavior, this self-organized emergent behavior of all these neurons in some way functionalizes this, whether that means like, assign this value to reaching for the table in this way.
Right. So let's think about that. So why is it that we more or less move the same way, in the sense that, take this robot arm experiment. When you hold a robot arm, you move it from here to here, and if you experience these forces that did this to you, you somehow come back to more or less a straight line, but not quite a straight line. You actually slightly overcompensate, and then your arm comes back. So people in this new way of move in slightly different way than otherwise. Meaning that if your environment was one where there was this river that you have to cross, you kind of shoot. If you want to go straight across, you kind of shoot upstream, and then you let the water bring you back. Okay, so the way to think about that is that movement was the result of some form of realization that, and I don't mean that in a conscious way, just some implicit way, that if I were to aim upstream, it would be somehow less effortful for me than try to go straight, because I would get pushed down, and obviously you don't want to aim downstream because you have to be moving. So somehow it's less effortful, meaning it's better. That like there's some kind of critic that we have in our brain that after we completed some behavior is able to tell us, was that any good or not? And that it by itself appears to be sufficient to help us, try to get a little bit better. And I suppose the role of a teacher, you teach movements, is to help you find the next step, to make it a little bit better. Because oftentimes by ourselves making a movement and looking at somehow the way we made it, it's really hard to figure out the way the next one should be. You know about the high jump story and Dick Fosbury. Okay, so I'll just briefly describe this, because I think it's on the one hand, it's potentially relevant to what we're discussing.
Absolutely.
So Dick Fosbury, he was an engineering student at Oregon State University, I think it was. He was a member of the track team. And they were involved in the high jump, and he was doing the high jump. And back then the high jump was more or less you go and you roll over the bar. And you would fall on straw or some grass or something like that. But with the development of the foam and the padding that you could jump, then it was less dangerous to fall on your neck, which is what you would have to do if you're going to cross the bar with your back above the bar. And he came up, as far as I know, on his own with this idea of jumping so that I will cross the bar so that my back is above the bar. And when you do that, because your head and your legs are below the bar, your center mass is below the bar. So that's a more efficient way to do that. But that only is possible if you're going to fall on a significant amount of padding. Otherwise, you would break your neck. So I think about that as sort of the cost-benefit ratio changed significantly with improvement of the landing zone.
Right.
And that made it so that this policy, this new way of jumping, became affordable, and you could do it without, killing yourself.
The teaching aspect is, to me, I think there's been a lot of, there's some good empirical evidence, and the theoretical stuff is like so much more complicated, and mechanisms are always so hard to tease out. But when I've taught, this approach has been so much more effective. So before, I was operating kind of with the traditional approach of like, and it's interesting talking to you because even you were saying like the conscious brain is not controlling any of this, right? But somehow we were operating with this model of motor programs, right? That this is the correct way to do XYZ, right? Here's how you do the high jump. This is this high jump. This is that high jump. This is a handstand. This is a takedown, right? These are these patterns. These are these established patterns. And so what we want to do is we want to get your body to do that pattern.
Right.
We want to reinforce that pattern,
right.
have it stored somewhere,
right.
and then repeat it, reinforce that storage, and then you'll be able to recall it and execute that in higher pressure situations. And so with this approach, what it leads us to is, I think, to the extent, certainly that we're not using stored motor programs, but then also potentially to an even further extent, if we're not predicting the movement, if it's not mediated so much by these mental representations, or certainly cognitive representations, that it makes a lot more sense to teach people through tasks and allow them to explore and find their own solutions, rather than to say, here's the high jump, here's how you do it. Let's repeat it, and now you did that wrong, right? Another way to say it would be like, if you had people learning that reaching force field task, you could tell them, and this is an experiment that could be done, which is cool. You could tell them, hey, like, this force, as you reach, like, this force is going to come in from the right, and you're going to have to compensate for that to accurately get to the goal.
Yeah.
Or you could also like just give them the task and like set up the environment and the force field in ways that it's going to challenge them to like effectively and accurately actualize that outcome, and give them some sort of feedback.
So the incentives, for example. But coming back to the notion of, say that you have this force field task, which is one of the dumbest tasks to work, right?
I think it's very clever.
So okay. I have a colleague in Canada, Paul Gribble. He asked, what if I watch you learn to move this robot? Does it help me do the same thing? And so that meant that if I watch somebody acquire a task, then is that something that is useful for me to learn how to acquire the task? And when you think about it, this is a proprioceptive task, a task that you have to feel. So you would think that just watching somebody do it wouldn't be helpful, but in fact, they've shown that
really?
Observing other person learn to do the task. So it's not enough to learn. It's not enough for me to watch an expert do the task. But if I could watch somebody learn to do the task, see the steps along the way and the errors that they make, perhaps that's useful for me to jump some of the steps that are required.
Yeah.
And so learn not from my errors, but learn from watching your errors.
That's so interesting. I would assume, though, that watching the expert do it is still helpful. It's just that
If it's a completely proprioceptive task,
yeah,
I don't know why it would be helpful. Like
I mean, but I wouldn't
just
have
doing
said
it
I wouldn't have
perfectly.
said watching the other person learn it would be helpful either.
But you would see them getting pushed.
Oh, okay.
You would see the errors that they're making.
Okay.
And so
that makes sense.
So the idea is that as I am watching you, I expect you to perform in a certain way. When you don't, that's an unexpected thing that I'm seeing. I can begin to understand something about why is that forming? And perhaps I would say, oh, perhaps I should do this. Perhaps that would help. That's the theory. I don't know if that's true. But if you make no errors, and if I were to watch you and you make no errors, I don't know if I can learn anything from you.
Yeah.
Does that make sense?
Totally makes sense. I agree.
So to give this to you as an analogy toward just something everyday thing that we do, I use a word process. And when you misspell a word, you could right click and it'll tell you the right spelling. I believe you will never learn how to correctly spell that word. On the other hand, if you misspell a word and you try to correct it, you see if that's the correct word, but I think there's a better chance you're going to learn actually the spelling.
Yeah, absolutely. And then there's deeper implications with AI now, and will the kids learn anything?
Yeah. So the importance of making errors is that I think that's a central concept in learning.
Mm-hmm.
On the other hand, it's not enough. It's not enough to make errors because certain tasks are hard to do. I make an error. I don't do it well. I don't do it well. I don't know what to change.
Yeah.
The errors are so distal from hitting a golf ball.
Yeah.
I have to do so many things before I see where the ball goes.
Yeah.
And I don't know what am I supposed to change so that the ball doesn't go there. It goes over here.
Yeah. We have this one. That's this idea of functional variability from Bernstein's hammer, right? So the idea, and you know more about this than I, feel free to at any point tell me that I have no idea what I'm talking about, but especially now. But the idea that skilled performers, so with Bernstein's things, you would expect, okay, you get novice blacksmiths and expert blacksmiths, and the experts, they can strike it very precisely, right? But you would expect that they are replicating the manner in which they strike it more accurately each time, right? If they're copying a motor program, you would expect that it's a very precise copy every time, like a printer or copy machine. And what you actually see is that there's more variability in their individual joint movements.
But the thing that matters is less variable.
Exactly.
Yeah.
They create the more precise outcome.
It's a beautiful example of how task-relevant variables are controlled, and then the things that are task-irrelevant, they fall into place in such a way that you are allowed to control the relevant variable.
Yes.
And also, that's a beautiful idea also that is formalized in optimal control. Again, the idea being that you have a goal associated with a low-dimensional variable. Let's say it's a ball. The ball in this three-dimensional space that you live in should go to that hole over there. And yet you have this high-dimensional action that you're going to do, all of the joints in your body and so forth that have to do it. And then at the end, that becomes a strike of this golf ball that's going to go to some location. And if, like the hammer that you described, what matters is the final thing. Where did that go? All of this stuff here is irrelevant. What matters is at the end. And in the case of Bernstein and the let's say a skilled carpenter, they can do this at various angles. They can have different initial conditions, and the arm can move in some largely different ways. But the relationship between these degrees of freedom and the thing that matters is what is controlled. And so to give you a notion of this, so if we think about it in terms of optimal control says that the cost is associated with the accuracy of this hammer and this nail. All of these other things are things that we're going to change the position of this hammer, but the cost that matters is this. So the machine that has optimized this performance makes it so that if I were to put a splint so that you could no longer move this joint, it would find a pathway that would still result in the accurate hitting of that hammer, despite the fact that what this is doing is now different. I never stored, because you can change this and I can still hit it with with reasonable accuracy.
That's a great explanation. Yeah, to me, I always had interpreted that as like, how could you do that with an internal model? But that's a great.
So the notion here is that the distal goals, retiring in Bahamas, hitting a nail on the head, these things are low dimensional, specific things that say, this is the goal that I have. And then you have all these degrees of freedom of how to perform that goal. But the idea is that finding a way that whatever action you did choose, whatever patterns you end up using, still produce this goal that you have. And there's huge redundancy, right? There's no correct way of doing it except for the thing that matters, which is, did it hit the nail on the head? Was the ball close to the hole?
These policies that you have are very flexible in terms of how the body is actually actualizing.
So yeah, just to be clear, the policy is a representation of action given the state that you find yourself in. So I am at this state, at this moment in time, this is my distal goal. What is the best thing that I can do now? And so in a golf swing, it would be, there's my goal. At every moment in time, I have some state of my body, the state of the golf club, it's going to hit something. And that each moment in time, I am telling you something about my policy. And that policy might be such that because of the noise in my arm or whatever, my arm moved in a slightly different way here. It should compensate for that so that at the end, it hits the ball in a way that it gets there. If I have a goal of flying to or arriving at some wedding in Los Angeles, that's my distal goal. I find myself today in Baltimore. I planned this excursion to get to Los Angeles, but every step of the way, the world is going to give me contingency, and I'm going to have to update my plan based on what the world actually provides for me. And actually, one of the neat things about these policies is that at some point, it tells you should give up. So there are certain things that the best action now is to give up, not keep trying. This is also another link to decision making and movements under the framework of having policies that result in optimizing some endpoint cost. And in a sort of a very grandiose way, evolution, what is it about? It's about optimizing what? How genes transfer from one generation to another. It's another form of optimal control. And we're just vessels, right? We're just carrying these genes for some greater purpose, which is
having more genes.
Having immortal, basically, genes never die.
Okay, so the next one is symmetry.
Symmetry, interesting. What do you mean by that?
So that's a symmetry in the relationship, in the importance of the performer and the environment. So in the traditional models, if we're thinking about golf, we think about the golfer. Yeah. Right? We think about, okay, let's track where the hands went, where this went, where that went. And potentially even more, we think about how, what's controlling that, we think about the brain. We think, there's this tendency to think of like, all the important things are happening in the brain, right? And so in this model, we think about we would see that as an asymmetry of like, okay, the individual is up here and the environment is down here.
I see.
And so for us, we're thinking of like individual and the environment are symmetrical.
I see.
And we think about our unit of analysis, our principal unit of analysis is the performer environment complex.
Interesting. Yeah.
So how are the dynamics of so for us, we'd think about, if we're thinking about that same golf swing, we think about, okay, where's the wind? Where's the golf ball? Where's the hole? All the things in the environment. Where's the club? and the person and the person's brain
Right,
obviously is important, but
right,
you know, we're thinking about that whole complex.
right, right. Yeah, the state with which you perform the action is a combination of you and the environment. It's that tic-tac-toe game. I can't play it by myself. That my action depends on what did the other person do, what state they brought me to. In this case, the environment plays the role of the other person. Yeah. Um, in isolation, it's not interesting.
Yeah. Is that not then an optimization of, to me, what that starts to sound like you're describing is not an optimization of something that's stored in the brain.
It's a policy.
Yeah.
The policy is, again, my analogy to it is the golden rule, the 10 commandments. These are policies. These are ideas that are describing to you how you should behave, just in case you find yourself in some scenario that would be where you have some decision to make. And policies, in the case of very simple movement, a saccade that takes 60 milliseconds, move your eye from here to here, is a description of how you're, moment to moment, you should change the activity in these muscles so that you get to there. If you start from this state, if you start from some other state, it'll be something else. And if along the way, maybe something hit your eye, you would know what to do. In a more realistic scenario, would be something like, I want to look to that side, but when I look to that side, when I start here and I look to that side, I turn my body after I initially move my eye, then I turn my body. So that involves a coordinated motion between my eyes, my head, and my body. Okay, and I should do it in such a way that presumably not just brings that location on my fovea, but makes it so that after I get there, that my body is centered toward the thing that I'm looking at. Otherwise, I'd be looking at it like this, which is uncomfortable. So to coordinate those three things together, my eye, my head, my body, I do it in order to achieve a simple goal, which is to bring that item on my fovea, which only cares about my eye. So I have this one dimension, but to achieve that, I have many other dimensions that I have to coordinate to get there. And at the end, I want to be in such a posture that maintaining that location isn't so costly for me. And so one can do that. Now, if I was sitting in a chair that I couldn't rotate, then I would have to perform that same action without rotating my hips, just my shoulder and my head and my eyes. So that would be under the same goal, under this constraint, would result in a different action. But what is consistent there is that the goal remains the same. Move your eyes so that you foveate some location to the side, but you'd have to do it under constraints where, your chair rotates or doesn't rotate. And so you can't store these programs. You have to have policies that provide you with instruction of, if you're at this state, at this moment in time, you do this. Now, how are these policies? So these are just mathematical concepts. We don't know how these things are encoded in the brain, but we know that they're not useless to think about the actual behavior. Because if you look at a human being performing these movements under these different constraints, you see that immediately, as soon as they realize the chair doesn't rotate, well, they don't rotate their hips. They compensate and they move as if they understand that constraint. They interact with this environment differently.
Right. This is so interesting. Yeah, it's so different than I thought you would say. There's a lot more similarities.
I think it's a mathematical way to describe high dimensional systems in which the long-term goals are low dimensional, which is pretty much a lot of what we do.
Can you explain more what do you mean by one dimensional? Like you got to the Bahamas or not? Or
so I don't know if that's one dimensional, but in terms of movements, our goals are usually in terms of something we want to look at, some place that we want to go. And they are descriptions of states in low-dimensional things, position. But we have this multi-dimensional body that has to be moved to actually get there.
All the degrees of freedom.
Yeah, all the degrees of freedom. And along the way, there may be constraints that we didn't anticipate. And the chair didn't rotate, or the can was half full. These are things that we didn't anticipate. But we have to interact with the real world out there. So as soon as we interact with it, we evaluate what we are observing, and then we say, okay, actually, according to my policy, I'm at this state now, and now this is the best thing that I could do. And so These are feedback control policies. And how are they stored? Where are they stored? To link it to the brain, let's think about something like Parkinson's disease. So the movements there are different. They become slower. The voice becomes lower. Why? Why do movements become slower? And so one way to conceptualize that is that somehow the cost that is associated with rewards and effort, somehow this balance has changed. Because when something is more rewarding to me, I will place more effort to achieve it, which means I will move fast. And so is in Parkinson's disease, this degeneration of this neurotransmitter dopamine. Dopamine is associated with reward. Does that change the cost-effort balance in my brain? So somehow certain movements are somehow more effortful. So there are these case studies. There are these reports about people who have been bedridden. They're unable to move, but there's a fire, and they get out of bed and they run out of the house. So under extraordinary circumstances, they can move, but under normal circumstances, they do not. There are these reports of people, doing extraordinary things, despite the fact that under normal circumstances, they are incapable of doing those things. So the thought being that maybe that's an example of how the value that's associated with the action overcomes whatever effort cost that we have. And so coming back to Parkinson's disease, one idea is that loss of dopamine has altered the effort reward balance here. And that somehow has made movements slower, perhaps because slower movements are less effortful. They cost less energy. Maybe this is the way to think about it. And anyway, I don't know if that's true or not, but that's an idea that can help us understand the link between this cost, this thing that I've been describing about, and how we move in order to optimize this cost.
How would you feel about the idea that tell me if I'm like using the word policy wrong, or if there's a better word to use, but if the policy isn't per se stored in the brain so much as a way that the body and the environment interact?
It has to be an interaction. A policy by definition is an interaction between moment-to-moment feedback from the environment to your system that is evaluating that feedback and saying, how close am I to the goal that I want to achieve? And if I am at this state, I've received this feedback at this moment in time, but I have this long-term goal. What is the best action that I can do now? And so in the short time frame of a movement, it's the sensory feedback that I get as I'm performing the movement. It's the same idea as retiring in Bahamas. In the long time frame, it is I performed this action. I spent this 2 hours with Reza. It was a complete waste of time. This is not going to get me to Bahamas to retire. What is the best next action that I should do?
Can you talk more about what you have seen so far of evidence of these policies in the brain, in the way the body coordinates movement?
Typical examples are experiments where you have a goal, you have to make a movement, people have some typical way of making it, and then you look at the variability that they have, and then you try to understand what is it that they're willing to be willy-nilly about? What component of their behavior they don't care about? And what is it about that they do care about? And you see that first of all, the things they don't care about are living in a part of the space that's orthogonal to the things that you do, that you're trying to control. Then what you can do is that you can change the constraints of the task. You can make it so that you can't no longer perform the movement like you wanted to. Yeah, you have to do it in some other way. And you see, okay, what paths do they choose to do it? How do they respond to the altered constraints that you have? And that's another way to check this. But, ultimately, it's really hard because we don't know this cost function. So I don't know what is it that you're trying to optimize. So presumably whatever it is that you're doing is somehow good for the cost function that you have. But me not knowing what that cost function is and having a theory that says, oh, everything that you do is optimizing something is kind of circular. So unless we understand what it is that people are trying to optimize, we can always fit some function to it and say, this looks consistent for this person. And so it's the danger of that scenario. But look, there are real things that happen to us in terms of momentary change in the value that we assign to things around us. As I mentioned to you, we move faster toward things we value more. There are long-term things that happen to us. We slow down as we grow older. Then there are these pathological things that happen. The dopamine system dies as we get Parkinson's disease. And our movements change. In all of these cases, our movements change. And the thesis here is that the movements are a reflection of some policy that is trying to optimize some kind of cost. And that cost is some balance between effort and reward. And one could make the argument that the reason why these costs matters is ultimately we're trying to, be as lazy as possible and get as much reward as possible.
Yeah. And so it sounds like you're also on board with the idea that the individual joints are kind of self-organizing to actualize the outcome.
What matters is what you're doing at the end effector. So if you lived in a world where, your elbow controlled things, right? If this is what mattered, well, then you would really care about, your upper arm. But you live in a world where your hand matters. These things, except when you're sitting at a airplane seat, there your elbows matter. So, you can't, you better be careful about the way you reach.
And then the last one here was just perspective control. And I think this matches up with your theories perfectly, because I'll ask you. Yeah.
What is perspective control?
So the idea is that we're, rather than recalling a stored motor program, that we are prospectively controlling our movements in relation to the information that we're receiving, both in the combination of information of, like, what is going on right now. Like you were talking about the state, right? So like, what optical information am I perceiving? What state is my body in? What, all the information of my body, all the information I'm getting from the environment, and the relation between the two, that we are coordinating our movement continuously,
yeah,
in relation to that information, rather than like recalling some sort of program.
Right. So in the mathematics that describe these kinds of behaviors, what you have is a system that is continuously receiving feedback, often delayed, but then you also have a system that is predicting what should I be getting. And the combination of what you were predicting about the feedback and what you actually got makes it so that then you can make estimate of the state that you're in, so you can perform the policy that you have, which is why I don't feel my clothes on me, because I predict that when I make a movement, that's the feedback that I should be getting. Similarly, when you are walking, the world around you is moving on on your visual feedback that you're getting, but your perception isn't that the world is moving. Your perception is that you're making advance. You're the one who's moving. But in terms of what you see in your eyes is that the world is going backwards. My perception is that I'm moving forward. And my ability to incorporate what I see and then form a perception of what is happening in the world is because I realize that I'm also sending commands to my body, and that those commands should produce some motion of the visual world if I am locomoting. And if it doesn't, then that means that, I either didn't move, something didn't change, or that maybe I'm on a conveyor belt. Sure. That when I move, it also moves me backwards, so then everything stays stationary. So these things are taken into account for me to form a perception of the reality in which I live, which is the basis of how, rides in amusement parks are designed, so that you get the perception of motion without actually moving.
Are you aware of the moving room experiments?
Tell me.
This is one of my favorite experiments. It's such a clever design, but basically, they put people, I believe, on a balance beam. And then so what they do, they put you in like a room, but it's really a hanging room with 3 walls in front of you. And so you're balancing on this beam, but then they move the room around you. So the room either comes towards you or moves away from you. And as they do that, people fall.
Right.
And then you can do like funny experiments where like you can you can move the room towards them or away from them, or you move them forward or backwards, and you ask them like, which way are you going, and are you moving, and every time they'll perceive essentially however the room is moving relative to them. Like if the room moves closer to them, they perceive this expansion of the optic field,
Right.
and then I'm moving
It
forward.
must be moving forward. Yeah. Right. Even if they're standing still. Yeah. Because usually that's what happens.
Right. Yeah. Right. And yeah, I think in a lot of the ecological psychology literature and thought process, that's thought of as like, oh yeah, of course, because we're directly interacting with the environment, and like our perception of movement is based on that optic flow, right? The expansion of that field. But maybe you would say that that's just affecting that's kind of how the policy is constructed.
The usual way by which this would happen is if I were to move forward.
Yeah.
Did I just move forward a little bit? You might even have a sensation that it was associated with that perhaps I just wasn't paying attention and I was slightly moving forward. An example of that is that you could play a trick on somebody. If you have a friend, you have two cars, you and your friend go and you get to a red light, and you're on this lane, your friend is in this lane, between you there's somebody who's sitting there. And if you both slightly move backwards, that person would all of a sudden put their foot on the brake, thinking that they jump forward.
Sounds like a dangerous experiment. Do it in a parking lot, maybe.
Yeah,
that's wonderful.
I used to live in Los Angeles, and we would get earthquakes, and one of the strangest feelings is to be in a car that's at a red light and the earth begins moving, shaking, because you feel like there must be somebody hitting my car.
I guess, and maybe the most central question is like, how do we know if our perceptions are mediated by these representations or not? What are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, I think we need to gather data that looks at how we perceive things and the context in which we do it and the state in which we're in. I think one of sort of a personal experience with this, our interactions with people is based on the way we think what an average person would be reacting, and but there are people who don't react that way when in that context, when that that event occurs, and then we might misperceive it as being some slight against us or some favor in front of us, or our interactions with people is based on what we would consider to be, this is how on average a person would do if this were to happen to them. And if it doesn't happen to them, then we would automatically imagine it must be something, did we do something wrong, or did we make a misstep? Mm-hmm. And it could be because it's the context that we're in, or the state that we're in, or what happened to them before. And so we perceive, and we take great deal of effort in making sure that we interact with people correctly, and we have perceptions of how they evaluated us and did they react to us the way we thought that they would do if they liked us. But it could just be because this person, had a bad morning. Or to give you an example, I think about interacting with a lovely waitress at a restaurant. They come and they're so great towards you, and you think, oh, I must be a great customer. Or maybe because the person before you left a good tip.
Or maybe they're in a good mood.
Because they left a good tip.
Could you tell me a story about maybe one of the most interesting experiments or findings that's happened in your career?
Well, it would be with Henry, HM, the one that I described to you, partly because I hadn't appreciated how a human being can appear as perfectly normal and yet, not have this fundamental ability of remembering things from minutes ago, and yet having other kinds of memories that are so much intact. And the concept that this brain of ours is made up of these modules that, at least in the case of certain kinds of memories, are specialized, and damage to those would produce things that have specific deficits in specific kinds of behavior. And And as I mentioned to you, the thing that surprised me is the apparent benefit of not having long-term memory is not having worries. It's interesting, but you know, as you perhaps can tell, I'm a half full glass kind of guy. So even in the case of terrible amnesia, I will find that yeah, you don't get stressed out.
That's great. And so where can people find out more about you and your lab and your research?
There are 3 books that I've written with my co-authors. The latest one is called Vigor, which is basically this concept that how the value system affects the way you move. And I'm happy to answer any questions that people have or any conversations that individuals would want to have. Thank you so much for, you know, taking the time, coming out here to meet me. And
yeah, this was wonderful.
Been a pleasure. It's been a pleasure being with you.
Thank you so much.
Thank you, Brad.
This is amazing.
I'm glad. I'm glad. You were wonderful. Your enthusiasm, your enthusiasm was fabulous. But you know, I also want you to know this is the truth. This is I really love this stuff.
Yeah. Yeah. Me too.
I really love it.
Yeah.
And I hope that people will be inspired to study it and add to it.